late August 1944, northern France. The war map lies flat across a wooden table inside a command tent pitched in churned soil. Pins and greased pencil arrows crawl eastward, stretching farther than anyone expected. Some arrows run clean off the paper's edge. No one moves to redraw them. Outside, engines idle without fuel. Trucks sit nose to tail along narrow roads, their drivers asleep on steering wheels, waiting for orders that will not come tonight. Dust hangs in the air, unmoved. The sound of artillery is distant, now too distant. Inside the tent, General Omar Bradley studies the map in silence. He does not speak. He does not point. His eyes remain fixed on one detail that should not exist. An American army nearly 200 miles ahead of where the planners said it should be. The reports arriving from the east are not reports of battle. They are inventories. Empty tanks. Dry fuel lines. Radios asking the same question again and again. How much farther? Bradley understands the answer before anyone says it. This is no longer a question of advance. It is a question of reach. And somewhere far beyond the last dependable supply line, George Patton is still moving. The realization settles quietly heavy, irreversible, and it carries the story backward to how this moment was allowed to happen at all. By the summer of 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a phase few Allied planners dared predict with confidence. For nearly 2 months after the Normandy landings, progress had been measured in hedgerows, villages, and yards of blood-soaked earth. German resistance, anchored by experienced formations and reinforced by terrain, had slowed the Allied advance to a crawl. Casualties mounted, patience thinned. That stalemate broke in late July. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25, 1944, shattered the German line west of St. Lo. A massive aerial bombardment tore open defensive positions, and American ground forces surged through gaps that had not existed the day before. The breakthrough was not clean, but it was decisive. Within days, German cohesion in Normandy began to unravel. On August 1st, the U.S. Third Army was formally activated, and command was handed to Lieutenant General George S. Patton. The timing mattered. Patton was unleashed at the precise moment the enemy could no longer absorb speed. The Allied command structure at this point was deliberately layered. Supreme authority rested with General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Beneath him, General Omar Bradley commanded the U.S. 12th Army Group, overseeing multiple American field armies. Montgomery, commanding Allied ground forces in the north, shaped the broader operational vision. Each role existed to prevent chaos, to ensure that momentum never outran control. Patton accepted none of this quietly. His Third Army was designed to exploit, not stabilize. It was built for movement, for pursuit, for the belief that an enemy in retreat must never be allowed to breathe. From the moment Third Army units rolled south and east from Normandy, they moved at a pace that unsettled their own staff officers. In the first weeks of August, Patton's formations covered distances that pre-war planners had considered reckless. Entire corps advanced faster than supply tables allowed. Divisions bypassed resistance rather than reducing it. German rear guards were brushed aside, not destroyed, as the Third Army poured through central France. This speed delivered results. German forces, already disoriented by the collapse of the Normandy front and the growing encirclement at Falaise, were unable to form coherent defensive lines. Cities fell with minimal fighting. Prisoners were taken in the tens of thousands. Roads, once choked with retreating enemy columns, now carried American convoys racing east. But the structure supporting that advance was fragile. Allied logistics in 1944 were built on predictability. Supplies moved from beaches, ports, and depots along carefully planned routes. Fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts flowed forward according to schedules calculated months earlier. The system worked when armies advanced at expected speeds. It faltered when those expectations were shattered. Patton's Third Army consumed fuel at a rate no staff officer could comfortably justify. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and artillery all competed for the same resource. Each mile gained multiplied the distance supplies had to travel. Ports capable of relieving the strain Antwerp most critically remained in enemy hands. To compensate, the Allies improvised. The Red Bull Express was established in late August, a massive trucking operation designed to rush supplies forward from Normandy depots. Thousands of drivers ran nearly non-stop, hauling fuel and ammunition along marked routes under strict traffic control. It was an extraordinary effort, but it was not a solution built for permanence. Even as convoys rolled, warnings accumulated. Quartermasters reported shortages. Corps commanders flagged increasing delays. Fuel allocations were trimmed, then cut outright for units deemed lower priority. Patton refused to slow. From his perspective, hesitation was more dangerous than exhaustion. German forces, though battered, were not destroyed. If given time, they would reorganize, reinforce, and counterattack. Speed, he believed, was the only guarantee of continued success. Within Bradley's headquarters, admiration began to coexist with concern. The Third Army was winning, but it was winning in a way that strained every assumption underpinning Allied command and control. And as August wore on, the distance between Patton's forward elements and their logistical lifeline continued to grow, stretching the system toward a breaking point that had not yet announced itself. By mid-August 1944, the advance across France no longer resembled a planned offensive. It had become a pursuit conducted at full speed, driven less by orders than by momentum. Patton's Third Army fanned out across the countryside, its columns moving along parallel roads, often advancing faster than maps could be updated. Distances that once defined operational boundaries dissolved. Some armored units covered more than 50 miles in a single day. Infantry divisions rode atop tanks and trucks, bypassing towns still echoing with the sound of retreating German units. Road junctions were seized before higher headquarters knew they existed. German resistance, though inconsistent, was not absent. Rear guards fought brief, sharp actions. Bridges were blown. Roads were cratered. But the enemy's greater weakness lay in coordination. Communications had broken down. Commanders lacked reserves. Fuel shortages mirrored those of the advancing Americans, leaving German formations incapable of sustained maneuver. For Patton, this was confirmation of everything he believed. The enemy was vulnerable. Pressure must not relent. For Bradley, the picture was more complicated. At 12th Army Group headquarters, reports began arriving out of sequence. Some units were so far ahead that radio contact lagged. Others paused unexpectedly, not because of enemy fire, but because fuel trucks had not arrived. The operational picture became uneven, sharp success in one sector, sudden stagnation in another. Fuel emerged as the dominant constraint. Third Army's daily requirements exceeded planned allocations by thousands of tons. The Red Ball Express, heroic as it was, could not satisfy every demand. Eisenhower's headquarters was forced to prioritize. Montgomery's forces in the north, preparing for a decisive thrust toward Germany, demanded their share. So the units tasked with securing ports and lines of communication. This was not favoritism, it was arithmetic. Patton interpreted it differently. He saw his advance as the most direct route to ending the war. Every mile gained reduced the enemy's ability to recover. Every pause risked squandering momentum bought with blood. When fuel was short, he redistributed it ruthlessly, stripping rear units to keep spearheads moving. When ordered to halt or consolidate, he pressed for exceptions. Bradley listened, but he also watched. He saw a field army increasingly dependent on improvisation. Maintenance schedules slipped. Vehicles were driven beyond tolerances. Crews operated on minimal rest. Maps no longer showed secure rear areas, only fluid zones of advance and vulnerability. The gap between Patton's forward elements and his nearest major supply depots widened steadily. 100 miles became 150. Then more. Each additional mile increased the time and fuel required to sustain the force already at the front. German commanders began to sense opportunity. Though unable to mount large-scale counteroffensives, they identified points where American units were isolated or undersupplied. Local counterattacks stiffened. Defensive positions hardened along natural barriers, particularly rivers leading toward the German frontier. The Moselle River line loomed ahead, not as a dramatic obstacle, but as a test of endurance. Crossing it would require fuel, bridging equipment, artillery support, and time resources already stretched thin. Within Allied headquarters, the language of caution grew firmer. Staff officers drafted contingency plans. Discussions of pauses and reallocations grew more frequent. Bradley's role required balance, maintaining pressure on the collapsing enemy while preventing overextension that could turn success into vulnerability. Patton continued to argue that the moment was fleeting. In late August, as Paris was liberated and headlines proclaimed victory, the reality at the front was more fragile. Third Army's advance had reached extraordinary depth, but its foundation was narrow. One disruption and delayed convoy, a failed bridge, a reinforced German defense could ripple outward with disproportionate effect. Bradley understood this. He did not yet act decisively, but the map on his table began to tell a story he could not ignore. The arrows pointing east were impressive. They were also dangerously long, and soon events would force him to confront exactly how far was too far. Behind every mile by the Third Army stood men whose endurance was quietly being consumed. Truck drivers in the Red Ball Express slept in ditches beside their vehicles, grabbing minutes of rest before engines roared again. Mechanics worked through the night under blackout conditions, coaxing life from engines driven far beyond their intended limits. Infantrymen rode forward in clouds of dust, unsure whether they were advancing into battle or into isolation. Letters home slowed as mail routes collapsed under the same strain as fuel lines. Units lost contact with their rear echelons and familiar routines dissolved. Meals became irregular. Water was rationed. The sense of momentum, exhilarating at first, gave way to fatigue that no victory announcement could erase. Speed had a human price, and it was being paid in small increments, unnoticed by most maps. For Patton, speed was not recklessness, it was doctrine. He believed that an enemy denied time to think was an enemy already defeated. His operational style emphasized deep thrusts, rapid exploitation, and constant pressure. Resistance was bypassed. Weaknesses were exploited without delay. This approach worked brilliantly against an opponent in disarray. German units retreating across France often found American armor on their flanks or rear before orders could be issued. Command posts were overrun. Supply columns captured intact. Entire formations surrendered without prolonged fighting. But speed as a weapon required uninterrupted motion. It could not tolerate pauses imposed by logistics or coordination. When forced to slow, the advantage evaporated, leaving exposed flanks and tired troops. Patton understood this risk and accepted it. He believed that any alternative was worse. Omar Bradley had risen through the American army with a different instinct. He valued cohesion, sustainability, and clarity of command. His success in Normandy had depended on careful coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. He believed wars were won by systems, not personalities. As commander of 12th Army Group, Bradley's responsibility extended beyond any single advance. He had to weigh Patton's gains against the needs of the entire front. Every gallon of fuel diverted to the Third Army was a gallon unavailable elsewhere. Every mile advanced created a new requirement to be defended. Bradley did not doubt Patton's brilliance. What concerned him was the narrowing margin for error. An army that advanced faster than it could be supplied was not merely bold, it was vulnerable. These philosophies, speed versus control, were not in open conflict. Not yet. But they coexisted uneasily, shaping decisions that would soon be tested by reality rather than theory. The tension between them did not announce itself with arguments or ultimatums. It accumulated quietly in delayed reports, strained logistics, and maps that no longer reflected the practical limits of movement. And as September approached, the strain began to show in ways neither man could ignore, pulling the narrative toward the next set of pressures closing in from all sides. To German commanders withdrawing across France, the American advance appeared chaotic yet terrifying. Columns moved with relentless urgency, often arriving where no resistance had been prepared, but beneath that speed, German observers noticed something else. American dependence on roads, fuel, and flow. Bridges destroyed by retreating units forced U.S. columns into narrow choke points. Roadblocks delayed convoys. Small delaying actions achieved disproportionate effects, not by stopping advances entirely, but by slowing them just enough to disrupt coordination. German fuel shortages mirrored those of the Allies, but the Germans adapted by fighting defensively, conserving resources, and buying time. Every hour gained allowed shattered units to regroup behind rivers and repaired lines. The further the Americans advanced, the more predictable their supply routes became. The enemy did not need to defeat the Third Army in battle. They only needed it to pause. The Third Army's power rested on machines. Tanks, trucks, artillery tractors, and radios gave Patton the mobility he prized. But mechanization imposed its own demands. Engines required maintenance. Tracks wore down, tires shredded under constant load. Fuel, above all, became the limiting factor. Unlike ammunition, which could be rationed in combat, fuel dictated whether units moved at all. A tank without fuel was not a weapon. It was a static liability. American logistical doctrine had not anticipated an advance of this speed over such distance. Without secure ports, the system could adapt, but only within limits. Improvisation replaced planning, and improvisation carried risk. Technology had enabled the advance, now threatened to halt it. As September neared, a moral dimension emerged beneath operational concerns. How much risk was acceptable in pursuit of victory? How many men could be exposed to isolation, counterattack, or deprivation in the name of momentum? Patton believed risk was inherent and unavoidable. He saw hesitation as a betrayal of opportunity. Bradley saw risk as something to be managed, not embraced indiscriminately. Neither view was immoral. Both were grounded in experience. But they led to different tolerances for uncertainty. The tension between these perspectives did not erupt in open conflict. It sharpened quietly, forcing decisions that could not be deferred much longer. The enemy was regrouping. Supplies were thinning. The advance had reached extraordinary depth. What remained was the moment when theory would collide with fact, when speed could no longer substitute for fuel, and command could no longer stretch itself thin without consequence. That moment was approaching, and it would arrive not with a sudden attack, but with the slow, undeniable realization that movement itself had become impossible. Early September 1944, the Third Army did not stop all at once. It slowed unevenly, like a machine losing pressure in separate compartments. One unit paused for hours, another for a day. Then entire formations reported the same condition in different words. Fuel exhausted. Forward of the Moselle River, armored columns sat in open fields, their turrets pointed east, engines cold. Infantry dug shallow positions not because they faced immediate attack, but because waiting without cover felt intolerable. Radios crackled with requests that could not be answered quickly enough. Patton's headquarters continued to issue aggressive orders, but execution faltered. Corps commanders reported that spearheads could advance no farther without resupply. Bridges could not be forced. Reconnaissance units ran out of fuel before completing patrols. At 12th Army Group headquarters, Bradley received the numbers. Fuel deliveries to 3rd Army had fallen dramatically. Red Ball Express convoys were stretched beyond capacity. Priority had been shifted north to support Montgomery's impending operation toward the Ruhr, a decision made at the highest level. This was the first time Patton's advance had been constrained not by the enemy, but by Allied command. Bradley understood the logic. He also understood the consequence. A field army that halted deep in hostile territory was not merely paused, it was exposed. The Germans, though battered, were already stiffening defenses along the Moselle. Units that should have been overwhelmed in motion now had time to dig in, mine approaches, and coordinate artillery. Reports from the front grew sharper. Casualties rose in local engagements that previously would have been bypassed. Time, the one resource Patton had traded everything else to secure, was slipping away. Bradley studied the situation with increasing concern. The Third Army's leading elements were now roughly 200 miles beyond the original Normandy beachheads. The logistical chain supporting them ran through damaged ports, congested roads, and overworked drivers. Any further disruption would have immediate effects. More troubling was the erosion of control. Patton continued to press for fuel reallocations, arguing that even a limited supply could restart the advance. Bradley listened, but he could not ignore the wider front. Other armies required support. Political pressure mounted to secure key objectives. Resources were finite. For the first time, Bradley considered the possibility that Patton's momentum had carried him beyond practical command limits. Not beyond authority. Patton still answered to him, but beyond the range at which intent could reliably translate into action. The maps no longer told a simple story. The Third Army's front line was not aligned at all, but a series of disconnected positions held together by intent rather than supply. As days passed, German countermeasures grew firmer. Crossing the Moselle became a grinding operation rather than a dash. What had been a pursuit turned into a contested advance. Bradley did not yet articulate his conclusion publicly, but internally, the assessment was forming. Patton had gone too far, too fast. Not in ambition, not in courage, but in distance. And as the logistical reality closed in, Bradley recognized that the decisive moment was no longer ahead of them. It was already behind. The realization did not end the campaign. It changed his character. and it forced decisions that would reshape the balance of the Allied advance in the weeks to come. The decision did not come with ceremony. There was no single order labeled as a turning point, no dramatic announcement transmitted across headquarters. Instead, it emerged through a series of reallocations, priorities, and silences. Fuel was the first signal. Allocations to the Third Army remained limited, even as Patton continued to argue that a concentrated burst could break through the Moselle defenses and restore momentum. Bradley, balancing Eisenhower's broader strategy, did not grant it. Resources flowed north instead, supporting Montgomery's planned thrust toward Germany. This was not a rejection of Patton's value. It was an acknowledgement of limits. With fuel scarce, Third Army operations became selective. Attacks were delayed or narrowed. Units rotated not for rest, but because only certain formations could be sustained at a given time. The wide, sweeping maneuvers that had defined August gave way to methodical, costly assaults. Patton felt the change immediately. His army was no longer the spearhead of the Allied advance. It had become one of several forces competing for attention and supply. Bradley watched the effect with a mixture of relief and regret. Relief that overextension might be contained. Regret that the window of exploitation so brilliantly opened had closed. A phrase that later summarized the moment was not official doctrine, but it captured the truth. The Third Army was nearly 200 miles too deep. Too far for improvisation to compensate. Too far for momentum alone to sustain. German commanders exploited the pause. Reinforcements filtered into the Lorraine region. Defensive lines solidified. Counterattacks, though limited, forced the Americans to fight for ground they might once have seized in motion. What followed was not defeat, but friction. The campaign in Lorraine stretched into weeks of attritional fighting. Progress slowed. Casualties mounted. The war did not end quickly in the West. For Bradley, the realization was sobering. He had unleashed Patton at precisely the right moment and had not reined him in soon enough. The system had bent without breaking, but only just. Patton, for his part, never accepted the interpretation fully. He believed the war could have been shortened had fuel been prioritized differently. History would debate the point, but the operational reality remained unchanged. The Third Army advanced again, eventually crossing the Moselle and pushing toward Germany, but it did so under new constraints within a tighter framework of control. The moment of absolute freedom, the wild, breathtaking dash across France was over. What remained was the long work of finishing the war, and as the maps were redrawn and the arrows shortened, the consequences of that overreach settled into the campaign's legacy, shaping decisions far beyond September 1944. The consequences of the 200 miles too deep advance became visible almost immediately, though they unfolded quietly like cracks in a foundation rather than sudden explosions. The Third Army's momentum, once the envy of Allied commanders, had slowed. Progress in the Lorraine region was measured in days rather than miles. Towns that would have fallen in hours required careful reduction. Supply lines strained under the weight of delayed convoys, broken bridges, and exhausted drivers. German units, battered though they were, exploited the pause. Defensive positions along the Moselle River became fortified, turning river crossings into deliberate, costly operations rather than rapid thrusts. Mines, anti-tank obstacles, and improvised fortifications forced American engineers and infantry to move methodically. Where August had been a blur of motion, September became a grind. Bradley's staff meticulously recorded the effects of overextension. Fuel consumption rates had exceeded projections by over 40% in some corps. Maintenance backlogs threatened the operational readiness of key armored units. Trucks, pushed beyond design tolerances, were being cannibalized to keep forward formations mobile. Staff officers worried not about enemy attacks, but about sustaining the force long enough to reach strategic objectives. Strategically, the pause forced a shift in Allied planning. Montgomery's northern thrust toward the Ruhr received priority in logistics. Eisenhower's headquarters directed resources to secure ports and supply nodes. Patton's requests, though not ignored entirely, were subordinated to the needs of the broader front. The operational freedom he'd enjoyed for weeks was effectively curtailed. For Patton, the change was palpable. His characteristic audacity collided with the arithmetic of supply and the necessity of coordination. Reports of stalled armored units, empty fuel tanks, and delayed artillery began arriving faster than he could respond. The force that had moved at a pace previously unimaginable was now tethered to the limitations he had sought to transcend. The psychological impact on commanders and troops was subtle but real. Soldiers accustomed to rapid advances experienced frustration and restlessness. Officers accustomed to decisive action faced delays and bureaucratic friction. Bradley, meanwhile, observed with the calm pragmatism that had guided his leadership throughout the war. He recognized both the brilliance of Patton's advance and the fragility it had exposed. Yet, despite these challenges, the Third Army did not collapse. Its pause allowed forces to regroup, resupply, and coordinate for subsequent operations. Patton would continue to lead, but under conditions dictated less by unbridled momentum and more by logistical reality. The lessons were embedded in both strategy and caution. Speed could deliver opportunity, but it could not substitute for supply, coordination, or control. This recalibration marked a turning point not just in the Lorraine campaign, but in Allied operational thinking. Commanders became acutely aware of the balance between daring advances and practical constraints. The experience would shape decisions for the remainder of the war, influencing how the U.S. Army managed armored forces, fuel distribution, and command autonomy in fast-moving operations. The story of the Third Army's two-deep advance was not one of failure. It was a study in limits, a reminder that brilliance must always operate within the bounds of reality. Bradley's recognition of those limits allowed the Allies to recover control, prevent disaster, and prepare for the next phase of the campaign. The full consequences of the overreach would continue to unfold, both on the ground and in the calculations of Allied planners, setting the stage for the extended battles in Lorraine and the eventual push into Germany. The weeks following the Third Army's overextension were defined by measured, deliberate operations. Where Patton had once relied on speed to overwhelm, the campaign now demanded patience. The Moselle crossings were no longer opportunities for rapid exploitation. They were calculated operations requiring engineers to bridge rivers, artillery to suppress fortified positions, and infantry to clear obstacles that in August might have been bypassed. German forces, though reduced and disorganized, exploited every tactical advantage. Local counterattacks, minefields, and artillery harassment slowed advances and forced careful planning. The pause in Third Army momentum allowed the enemy to stabilize sectors that had been abandoned during the chaotic retreat from Normandy. Though these gains were limited in strategic scope, they underscored the dangers inherent in operational overreach. The logistical lessons were equally stark. Maintenance crews caught up on backlogs. Fuel and supply chains previously strained to breaking were reorganized. The Red Ball Express continued, but with a more structured schedule. Commanders learned to calculate advance distances not solely by operational ambition, but by the finite realities of fuel, roads, and vehicle endurance. These adjustments prevented disaster and ensured that subsequent advances would proceed without the same extreme vulnerabilities. Bradley's reflections, later recorded in memoirs and staff reports, emphasized the delicate balance of initiative and restraint. He recognized Patton's genius in exploiting enemy weakness, but acknowledged that success could not be divorced from the realities of logistics. The lesson was operational and moral. An army could not outrun its own sustenance. Momentum, however intoxicating, required discipline and foresight. Patton, meanwhile, adapted his approach. While he continued to advocate for aggressive action, the pace of operations became more measured, informed by the constraints that had brought the Third Army to a temporary halt. His drive remained, but it was now tempered by the experience of having reached the outer limit of operational reach. The army moved forward again, crossing the Moselle, pushing into Lorraine, but with a renewed awareness that brilliance without support was perilous. The 200 miles too deep episode also shaped Allied strategic planning at higher levels. Eisenhower and his staff considered the implications for future operations, emphasizing the need for synchronized advances, prioritized logistics, and contingency plans for units that moved beyond their planned limits. Coordination between multiple armies became a central concern, ensuring that no single commander could inadvertently jeopardize the broader front. Ultimately, the Third Army's overextension was not a failure. It was a demonstration of the interplay between audacity and limitation. The pause allowed the Allies to consolidate gains, prevent catastrophic loss, and prepare for the final push into Germany. The story became a lesson in operational discipline, one that had formed armored warfare doctrine for decades to come. As September progressed, the Third Army's renewed advance proved the enduring value of Patton's aggressiveness, now integrated with Bradley's caution. The campaign in Lorraine continued, slower but sustainable, bridging the gap between brilliance and practicality. And in that measured advance, The consequences of having pushed too deep remained visible. The costs of overreach were real, and the boundaries of command had been tested like never before. The story of the Third Army in late summer 1944 is not a tale of victory or defeat in the conventional sense. It is a story of limits, of the point at which brilliance collides with reality and audacity confronts constraint. Patton's advance across France was breathtaking in speed, daring in conception, and devastating to the enemy. Yet, for all its success, it exposed the fundamental truth of warfare. No army can outrun its own sustenance. Bradley's recognition of the moment when Patton had gone 200 miles too deep was not an indictment of audacity. It was an acknowledgement that leadership requires balance. Momentum alone cannot secure victory. Coordination, logistics, and patience shape the line between triumph and catastrophe. In that realization, Bradley exercised a different kind of genius, the calm calculation that ensures brilliance can endure. For the men on the ground, the episode reinforced the fragile intimacy between human endurance and mechanized power. Soldiers, drivers, and mechanics bore the weight of speed, often unknowingly serving as the instruments through which operational limits became visible. Their labor, their fatigue, their quiet adaptation to the relentless push eastward defined the line between success and overreach. The Lorraine pause, the recalibration of supply, and a measured continuation of the advance demonstrated a profound lesson. Innovation in war must always operate within the bounds of reality. Genius without structure can falter. Courage without support can become risk. And yet, when audacity and discipline intersect, history can be reshaped in days. The Third Army would continue its march into Germany. Patton's legend endured. Bradley's prudence preserved the army, and the map, once drawn with arrows stretching impossibly far, became a testament not only to speed, but to the delicate architecture of command, the unseen limits of logistics, and the human cost of pushing past them. In the end, the lesson echoes far beyond 1944. In war, as in life, the distance we dare to go is measured